All right, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. So we have our first track of panels today. How this is going to work is we're going to do one panelist at a time. They're going to come do their presentation. We'll have some time at the end for questions. So if you have questions, you can go to either one of those two mics to ask questions. You can submit them through the app. If you do, go ahead and at the beginning of your question, if you can put track 1, then as all the questions from all the different tracks come through, we can figure out which one they are easier. We'll still read them all even if you don't, but if you put track 1, that'll be a little bit easier to find the questions that we need. So our first panelist today is Gretchen Miller, and she's from the Zachry Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering from Texas A&M University.
Good afternoon. I hope we're having a good day today. So today I am going to talk about an idea that's sort of captured the imagination of Texas since the most recent floods that were mentioned earlier today. And this is prospects for managed aquifer recharge using stormwater flows. The focus of our study today is Harris County, but many of the same concepts that I'm going to present here today and many of the same analyses can be applied anywhere throughout the Gulf Coast aquifer. So before I get into the material, I want to tell you a little bit about the project and to thank some of our collaborators in funding. So DRI stands for the Drainage Reuse Initiative, which was an initiative started out of Harris County Precinct 4's Commissioner Jack Cagle, who approached the Harris County Flood Control District and Binkley and Barfield, who then approached Texas A&M Engineering and A&M AgriLife. And we started work on this project in spring of 2017. My colleagues, Dr. Shang and Dr. Kaiser, have worked on this with me, as have my students, Ben Smith, Lee Ting Tao, Sahili Majumdar, and Patrick Carpenter. So what is managed aquifer recharge? The term of art in Texas tends to be aquifer storage and recovery, but ASR is only one part of a larger package of techniques to accelerate the recharge process into the subsurface. So among other techniques are things like infiltration basins, where we fill a basin with water and allow that to infiltrate down to the groundwater. This is done very frequently in El Paso. There's also what we call dry wells, which are wells into the unsaturated zone above the groundwater that will allow water to infiltrate. This is a really popular technique in Arizona. Bank filtration, where we're somehow accelerating recharge from a river or a surface water body, and then aquifer storage, transfer, and recovery, where we're injecting into one well and taking out from another. And so I start with this just to give the idea that there are a number of these techniques that can't accomplish the same thing as ASR does, but might be more appropriate for different geologic settings. Okay, so the first question is, why does Harris County need managed aquifer recharge? And this came up in the discussion earlier today. I was glad to see it. But this is a plot from 2000 to 2016 of the percent of area affected in Harris County by drought. And the darker colors here are the more exceptional droughts. And then Harris County flood events. And you can see the darker colors, the more damage versus the number per year. And I show this slide for two reasons. One, because I want to show that Harris County is indeed alternating in flooding versus drought events. And two, to make a little bit of an excuse. So we did this, and you can see I stopped this graph right before a major flood event, right? So we finished this project the month before Harvey hit. And we wanted to do a follow-on really quickly with some of the pilot testing, and I'll talk about our pilot testing later. But the flood control district was pretty busy for the next year after that. So we're back up and running, and hopefully, we're part of this portfolio of projects that the bond issue there is going to fund. Okay, so managed aquifer recharge for stormwater and flood control. And basically the question we're asking here is, can this technique be used as a flood control tool in Harris County? And that was the original question, coming out of these big events. And what we wanted to do was a feasibility study followed by the pilot project that I mentioned. This is a map from the flood control district of all of the detention basins and other stormwater facilities in Harris County. And because we were working with the flood control district and because we were initially tasked with seeing how this would work for flooding as opposed to a more groundwater-centric perspective, we centered a lot of our thinking around these detention basins, the places where we knew water was held for some period of time, and we might want to accelerate that water movement into the subsurface. Okay, so the first and I think most critical thing I want to talk about here is this idea. We have 4 challenges. The first challenge is the quantity challenge. Okay, so this is a mismatch in the scale between surface flows and subsurface storage. Okay, we have trouble conceptualizing how slow groundwater can be sometimes. Because we see rivers and we expect water to be moving at that capacity, we expect groundwater to be able to absorb at that capacity, but it's not quite true. So overall, what we've found is when we were looking at this is that this idea of MAR using floodwaters meant that it was excellent for promoting groundwater storage. There was plenty of water available, excess in floods, that we could use. Okay. However, it was inadequate entirely for any kind of flood control. We just can't remove the volumes that we need. And so when you hear, say, like Representative Larson talking about this now, it's using that floodwater, using extra stormwaters as an opportunity for groundwater as opposed to any kind of flood control mechanism. And I think that's the first big takeaway from this. But what that means is that smaller rain events we can maybe capture. And so this can be good for somewhere in between, particularly stormwater management, hence the title of the talk today. And so looking at it from this perspective, we look at, for each standard basin in Harris County, which is about 400 acre feet, how much flow rate do we need to empty it in, say, 1 day by 25%, or 7 days by 100%, right? So what's just the volume of water in there? And this is where we come down to that fundamental mismatch between the whole idea of acre feet and million gallons per day, right? So this is kind of our first set of thinking about how we put those two together conceptually. All right, so our second challenge is the quality of stormwater and particularly floodwater. So this is an example of stormwater as measured by the Flood Control District in White Oak Bayou. There's nothing particularly special about this, except this is where they had data. And as you can see, I've marked this chart in red with places where the drinking water standard for a particular constituent is frequently exceeded. Orange is where the secondary standards, so red is primary, orange is secondary standards. And then yellow are potentially problematic compounds in a technical sense, in things that could potentially clog or cause issues with ASR or infiltration or some other MAR technique. And so we see that copper, lead, E. coli, and fecal coliform are 4 of our biggest offenders here, the things that we have to worry about the most. The microbial ones are somewhat easy to deal with because it's easy to chlorinate maybe in certain, say in an ASR well as you're injecting. You add some chlorine and that's less of a concern. But the metals can be problematic and are classic pollutants in stormwater. The other things that cause problems are the suspended sediment concentrations, the total dissolved solids, and the total suspended solids for 2 reasons. One, they tend to tag, the metals tend to tag along with these particulates. And 2, they tend to clog our formations. And so high values of these require frequent cleaning of the well, frequent maintenance of the infiltration facility. Okay, then our third challenge is the geology challenge. So we were looking, and this is probably pretty universal from for the Gulf Coast aquifer, but not necessarily for every aquifer in Texas. The geology challenge here is that we have these sequences of sedimentary layers. Thanks for the figure, by the way. And these facies, which represent the ocean and the seaward progression and the deltaic layers coming in and out, cause deposits where we have channel sands, which are good for infiltration and ASR, and then interspersed with floodplain muds. And this can be quite problematic because what we want to hit are the high permeability sands and avoid the muds because they have lower infiltration rates. And so looking at this, we can maybe try to target areas that have more of the more favorable layers and less of the other ones. But the real challenge is this idea that it's very heterogeneous, very mixed, and we don't always know beforehand what we're getting when we look at any given site. Okay, so I want to talk about some of the pluses and minuses of each of the 4 different methods that we looked at to achieve this goal of emptying or partially emptying portions of these detention basins so that either more floodwater could possibly be stored in them or more stormwater, or that we could promote groundwater infiltration in these areas. Okay, so the first one is enhanced infiltration. And here we alter the bottoms of existing basins to promote their natural infiltration rates. And I say natural, but many of these basins, the way they're constructed, aren't constructed in a way that would promote infiltration. In fact, very frequently, they're dug into a heavy clay on purpose. Right? So we want to ask, okay, is there something that we can do, maybe soil amendments, trenching, or proprietary systems that might help us promote infiltration? Okay, so our findings showed that in Houston and in the Harris County area, we want to target the low clay formations. You can see from the soil survey maps, now keep in mind these are very superficial hydraulic conductivity values. The darker the color here, the more infiltration we would expect at the surface. And so you see this gradient between the areas around the ship channel and near the coast versus up in the northwest portion. And this is due to what is outcropping at the surface and which formation of the Chico Aquifer, and so we said any of these 2 formations, the Lissy or the Willis, would be good as opposed to the Beaumont, which tended to have lower permeability, more of these muds and less of these sands. Okay, so our next question is how much can we reasonably expect from this scenario? And say under a unit head gradient, so 1 meter of head, what's a reasonable fraction of stormwater that should infiltrate? In order to empty a basin, we would need to see an infiltration rate of 2,500 millimeters per day, which is quite high if you look at the average values in most of these areas, closer to a saturation or a conductivity of under 1,000. But what this means is 2 feet per day, or 610, was our general target for getting some water down and partially emptying the basin to allow for a little bit more storage over time. Okay, so in general, we said, well, this is really low-hanging fruit. This is something, if we could achieve those kinds of infiltration rates, the county could come back in, retrofit some of these basins with whatever method or technology we suggested to do this. And that might be a fairly easy, low-cost, easy maintenance sort of procedure, but we might not get the volumes that we would really like to see ideally. So the next possibility are dry wells or unsaturated zone wells. So these would be drilled, say, in the bottom of a basin to overcome that geology, that layered geology challenge. So you could drill these into, say, a sand formation that was underlaid by a clay formation. And that would mean that these would be good. So here's an example from California where they had this same sort of contrasting clay, sand, that worked fairly well and could work passively at the bottom of, say, one of these basins. Or it could be coupled with passive pretreatment in a scenario, say, like in a storm sewer. That's how they're done typically in Arizona. Okay, so we said, well, in this case, we're better off putting these in areas where there are low permeability clays at the surface, and we can maybe try to get below them into the more flowing formations of Chico, and they would work in these sorts of areas better than, say, infiltration basins. Okay, so we did a little bit of a modeling study here to determine what sort of volumes we could get from these. And one of our big findings here was that instead of focusing on having very big wells and putting lots of volumes down into them, what we really needed to see were these small, wells that had maybe low volumes, so over the course of an event, maybe only 50,000 gallons infiltrated, but lots of them in multiple places. So more of a low-impact development type of infrastructure or best management practices types of infrastructure rather than one big project. So there's some talk of doing these sorts of, encouraging developers to put in these sorts of wells alongside their sewer systems. Okay, so traditional ASR and ASTR, we wanted to look at this from the perspective of putting these sorts of wells near a basin or near a water source, say a existing reservoir, or say near a water treatment plant. That would otherwise discharge for non-beneficial use. And in this area, we have, essentially the two types of wells, unconfined in certain regions and confined in the lower layers in the lower aquifers of the Gulf Coast aquifer. So again, we found that the Chico portion of the Gulf Coast would probably be the most amenable to ASR because history of depletion and current ongoing depletion in the lesser regulated areas of the county leaves room for potential storage, places where there's ongoing depletion, but maybe the subsidence hasn't reduced storage as much, and in these high transmissivity areas that would be able to accept the water. Okay, so one of the big questions that the flood control district had was on pump technology and how much water could we possibly put down, and if we had bigger pumps, could we put more water down to get at the volume that we might need for our flow rates, for flood type situations. So, in general, our estimates showed that we could passively flow a well, so without any pump at all, at about 13 million gallons per day. And that would empty a standard basin in 13 days. We could use pumping to increase the flow rate, but it might be a bit of a waste of energy. And we don't want to get over an applied pressure of about 190 psi, because that's when we start having the same sorts of issues we have with hydraulic fracturing, right? We're changing our porous matrix. But below that limit, standard pumps are sufficient, but there's not really that much gain over just letting for passive infiltration. However, one injection well at 13 million gallons per day, which is big in the groundwater world, is not so big in the flood control district world. And so this was sort of a back-of-the-envelope calculation about how many days, if we gave it 4 days, what would be this, 1 day with 4 wells, how far apart would these wells need to be spaced? That was the idea. How many wells do we need and how big of an area do we need to infiltrate that target volume of water? And so we're seeing in some cases we can't even do it, right? We can't do one day with just 4 wells. It's not possible to have that kind of flow rate into these aquifers. But we can get some reasonable values once we're either doing it more slowly or adding more wells. The last thing we looked at was deep formation injection, and this is not so much for groundwater storage as it is for flood mitigation. So the idea here was that we inject flood water into these really deep basins or potentially even abandoned salt domes that might naturally have a total dissolved solids over 10,000. Now, why did we go for this? The idea here was that this was not regulated as drinking water, which goes back to the quality problem with ASR. I didn't mention that, despite the quantity capabilities here, we have a fundamental problem with the regulatory framework. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Hopefully we'll have time. Good, 5, okay. So looking at the deep aquifer injection and the most recent reports from Intera about from the Brockus study, really, the Frio or the Wagua formations would be good here, but the injection rates that we would get would be approximately 600 to 700 GPM at about an 800 to 1,000 feet spacing. Not very good for the volumes of water we wanted, and also going down that deep, massive construction costs associated with this. It would really be prohibitive of taking this approach. So this was one we took off the drawing board pretty quickly because of the expense. Okay, so to talk a little bit about the final challenge and the regulatory challenge, I told you the date, I guess, for my little bit of a third excuse here. So in 2016, we had a little bit different regulatory framework than we do now, which is now a positive thing. So looking at these different things, we looked, okay, what legally will the flood control district need to consider when they're doing these solutions? So for natural infiltration, the best idea we had of this was that a surface water permit and an injection permit would not be required. So anything that enhanced natural infiltration, even if we're doing something like a soil amendment or trenches, it was not unlikely that we were going to need permits for those. Dry well, however, possibly we would need a surface water permit, and we would certainly need a Class 5 injection well permit from the TCEQ. Now, the TCEQ, based on some of the recent regulatory changes, has now gone to saying that the scenario has become much more possible here to inject stormwater under a scenario like that, because instead of the regulation, which used to be if you're injecting water, it has to be a drinking water quality. They've now accepted this idea that non-degradation of the aquifer is what matters. Non-degradation of water supplies is what matters, as opposed to only being able to inject drinking water. And for the ASR community, that's a huge change. That's like a sea change, because it allows us to be a little bit more flexible as long as we protect groundwater quality on the water source that we use for these. And as far as the deep aquifer injection and a surface water permit, that was a big open question for us, but we would need a Class 1 injection well permit. So just to wrap things up here, as I mentioned, we wanted to get started on a pilot study right away. Harvey intervened, but we are now back in the progress of doing this. So we have a basin near Tomball that we are investigating for this, so in that northern portion where we thought infiltration would be at best. And we're testing 3 different types of enhanced infiltration against a control. And we're also testing for the county outlet structure changes in the detention basins to see if that water can safely be held a little bit longer than that 24-hour requirement that they have. So the 3 enhanced infiltration technologies we're testing are infiltration trenches, so long, narrow trenches filled with high permeability material. Soil amendments, so a mix of soil that has a higher permeability at the surface and can store a little bit more and let it infiltrate longer. And then a new system that is a proprietary out of Michigan called Parjana, which suggests that we can speed up infiltration that way. So in conclusion, just a few takeaways. ASR and Managed Aquifer Recharge are typically not fast enough for true flood control, but I would say they can be an important part of a stormwater management portfolio, particularly a low-impact development or best management-based management portfolio. The techniques should be matched to geology, and in our area that we investigated, the layering and the sand content are 2 of the biggest key considerations, and where the surface intersects those. Stormwater quality and pretreatment needs, probably the logistics of these are one of the biggest challenges. A little bit more science is needed there to determine how much some of these contaminants can be remediated as they're infiltrating. But the science the science is there from the stormwater management community. What's really lacking is a local knowledge of what's in the water and when it's in the water. But the pilot study is aimed at showing non-degradation of the ground, excuse me, of the groundwater nearby, and aimed at seeing if these techniques are going to be appropriate or if maybe they're just going to be insufficient in these soils. We hope that enhanced infiltration will give us rates that will be at least a little bit helpful from a stormwater management perspective. They'll certainly be helpful from a water infiltration, groundwater perspective. But we will hopefully have some results to show this time next year. Okay, so with that, I think I've left a little bit of time for questions.
So if anyone has any questions, y'all can just come up to the microphones. We don't have any from the app, so if anyone out there has any. You can.
So my question is, if you're using dry holes, it's a dry well already, it hasn't produced water. Do you know there's an aquifer down or something that contain the water?
Oh, so the question is if you're using a dry well. So I think that's a little bit of terminology maybe I should have clarified. So a dry well isn't one where we've previously explored for groundwater and attempted to do a production well. A dry well in this context, maybe a stormwater infiltration well might be the better set here, is one that we've purposely put above a known aquifer so that we've drilled it only as far as we know we don't have a water table.
Yeah, I had a question about, is any part of y'all's study also related to projecting what type of operations and maintenance might be there, or how much it would cost, and looking at that viability? Oh, and another question that's clarifying. Could you clarify the difference between the traditional ASR and the dry hole? Because I didn't see the difference entirely.
Oh, okay. So for the first question, I'll go back to sort of the figures here. So the dry well, I've drawn it so that the well screen, is above this natural groundwater table right here. And so this is into the Vado zone, the portion, the region that is not saturated with water. So this is above the groundwater table. And we put water in here, and we allow it to flow down so that there is some passive treatment in the subsurface in this buffer zone between where we're injecting the water and the groundwater table. It's kind of a water quality protection measure. Some places where these are common will regulate and say it has to take, say, 7 days to reach that, or 2 years to reach that, depending on the regulations. Other places will say you have to put this in 10 feet above the water table, or the average water table, which I think some of you might know is a really difficult piece of information to actually measure. And so then the second question was, on maintenance. So we're hoping with the pilot study, we'll get a better idea of maintenance over time and looking at how much sediment is accumulating and how much infiltration between events goes down. Only doing the project for a year might limit that a little bit, but my colleague, Dr. Shang out in El Paso, has been looking at the maintenance for their infiltration systems over a long period of time now. And, essentially they're out there in their basins with the bulldozer, I want to say once a quarter, and scrape off the top, and it's replenished after that. And it goes back up to the infiltration rate it had before. Hopefully we'll be able to see it, but as far as the time span of the study goes, it might be a little shorter.
So you mentioned that the duration of the pilot study was going to be roughly a year. Will we expect maybe an update at this conference next year or a publication in some journal?
Well, it's our intention to publish it, yes. Probably not this time next year on a publication, but I mean, if I get an invitation, I'd be happy to come back.
All right, well, thank you, Gretchen.
Thank you.
We'll go ahead and let, yeah.